A person who studies human societies and cultures, anthropologist. A person who studies the science of classification, taxonomist. A person who makes statues, sculptor. A person who repairs clocks and watches, watchmaker. A person who works in a laboratory, lab technician. A person who makes beer, brewer. A person who steals from shops, shoplifter. A person who works on a ship, sailor. A person who looks after a zoo, zookeeper. A person who specializes in the study of fungi, mycologist. A person who designs machines and engines, engineer. A person who writes essays, essayist. A person who grows grapes, vintner. A person who makes maps, cartographer. A person who manages a restaurant, restaurateur. A person who plays the violin, violinist. A person who mends water pipes, plumber. A person who studies human behavior and societies, sociologist. A person who deals with the science of heredity and variation in living organisms, geneticist. A person who writes stories or novels, novelist. A person who flies helicopters, helicopter pilot. A person who loves books, bibliophile. A person who works with wood, carpenter. A person who plays the guitar, guitarist. A person who prepares food in a restaurant, chef. A person who grows and sells plants, horticulturist. A person who studies earthquakes, seismologist. A person who composes poetry, poet. A person who deals in antiques, antiquarian. A person who repairs shoes, cobbler. A person who studies birds, ornithologist. A person who draws maps, cartographer. A person who plays the drums, drummer. A person who repairs electrical equipment, electrician. A person who plays the trumpet, trumpeter. A person who studies the stars and planets, astronomer. A person who writes plays, playwright. A person who performs in plays, actor. A person who designs buildings, architect. A person who collects stamps, philatelist. A person who plays the flute, flautist. A person who mends clothes, tailor. A person who plays the keyboard, keyboardist. A person who studies the universe beyond the earth, cosmologist. A person who conducts scientific research, scientist. A person who writes and records music, songwriter. A person who studies insects, entomologist. A person who gives legal advice, solicitor. A person who studies the brain and nervous system, neurologist. A person who is in charge of a museum or art gallery, curator. A person who plays the piano, pianist. A person who makes and sells medicines, pharmacist. A person who leads a choir, conductor. A person who acts as a go-between for two parties, intermediary. A person who repairs electrical appliances, electrician. A person who writes songs, lyricist. A person who designs and makes clothes, fashion designer. A person who decorates interiors, interior decorator. A person who studies the weather and climate, climatologist. A person who writes for a living, author. A person who makes sculptures, sculptor. A person who composes music, composer. A person who installs and repairs pipes, plumber. A person who practices magic, magician. A person who sells fish, fishmonger. A person who guides tourists, tour guide. A person who mends shoes, cobbler. A person who grows crops, farmer. A person who sings professionally, singer. A person who operates a machine, operator. A person who studies animals, zoologist. A person who sells books, bookseller. A person who writes plays, playwright. A person who creates computer software, developer. A person who specializes in treating diseases by surgery, surgeon. A person who sells vegetables, greengrocer. A person who practices law, lawyer. A person who studies space and celestial bodies, astronomer. A person who performs in a circus, acrobat. A person who flies an airplane, pilot. A person who serves food in a restaurant, waiter. A person who supervises exams, invigilator. A person who studies the structure of the earth, geologist. A person who sells fruit, fruiterer. A person who gives legal advice, counselor. A person who mends cars, mechanic. A person who trains sportsmen and women, coach. A person who writes articles for newspapers, journalist. A person who manages the financial affairs of a company, accountant. A person who sells flowers, florist. A person who travels to unknown places to discover new things, explorer. A person who writes the script for a film or play, screenwriter. A person who translates orally, interpreter. A person who studies the origin and history of words, etymologist. A person who repairs and maintains engines and machines, mechanic. A person who travels into space, astronaut. A person who treats people with psychological disorders, psychiatrist. A person who uses a typewriter, typist. A person who takes part in a contest, contestant. A person who is good at telling jokes, comedian. A person who investigates crimes, detective. A person who runs a business, entrepreneur. A person who takes care of children, babysitter. A person who designs and builds engines, machines, roads, etc., engineer. A person who buys and sells goods, trader. A person who attends to sick people, nurse. A person who treats eye diseases, ophthalmologist. A person who studies ancient artifacts, archaeologist. A person who practices or studies law, jurist. A person who is employed to drive a private car, chauffeur. A person who serves passengers on a train, conductor. A person who attends to passengers on an airplane, flight attendant. A person who writes about current events, journalist. A person who plays a sport for a living, professional athlete. A person who studies the mind, psychologist. A person who serves customers in a shop, shop assistant. A person who installs and repairs electrical systems, electrician. A person who treats people using medicine, doctor. A person who works in a restaurant serving food. Answer, waiter. A person who produces films, filmmaker. A person who works in a laboratory, lab technician. A person who trains animals, animal trainer. A person who tests eyesight and prescribes glasses, optometrist. A person who makes bread and pastries, baker. A person who directs a film, director. A person who plays a leading role in a film or play, actor. A person who studies fish, ichthyologist. A person who writes music, composer. A person who works with wood, carpenter. A person who delivers letters and parcels, postman. A person who studies the structure and function of the human body, anatomist. A person who uses a typewriter, typist. A person who manages a company's finances, accountant. A person who manages a hotel, hotelier. A person who tends to cattle, cowboy. A person who does scientific work in a laboratory, scientist. A person who designs the layout of books, magazines, etc., graphic designer. A person who is skilled in making things with metal, blacksmith. A person who works with stone, mason. A person who runs a bakery, baker. A person who studies human history through excavation, archaeologist. A person who manages or owns a farm, farmer. A person who writes computer software, programmer. A person who writes news articles, reporter. A person who studies weather, meteorologist. A person who writes articles for newspapers or magazines, journalist. A person who collects coins, numismatist. A person who designs and arranges gardens, landscape architect. A person who studies diseases, pathologist. A person who writes articles for newspapers or magazines, journalist. A person who travels into space, astronaut. A person who treats skin diseases, dermatologist. A person who collects and studies rocks and minerals, geologist. A person who is a medical doctor specializing in surgery, surgeon. A person who works in an observatory, astronomer. A person who grows flowers, floriculturist. A person who studies languages, linguist. A person who writes in a diary, diarist. A person who plays the cello, cellist. A person who specializes in the study of the atmosphere, meteorologist. A person who studies human societies, cultures, and their development, anthropologist. A person who studies and treats mental disorders, psychiatrist. A person who writes poetry, poet. A person who repairs and tunes pianos, piano tuner. A person who writes dictionaries, lexicographer. A person who works in a laboratory, lab technician. A person who performs on stage or in movies, actor. A person who studies prehistoric life, paleontologist. A person who manages a museum, curator. A person who travels to unknown places to discover new things, explorer. A person who studies the structure and history of the earth, geologist. A person who studies the function of living organisms, physiologist. A person who deals in wine, vintner. A person who performs illusions and tricks for entertainment, magician. A person who specializes in treating diseases by surgery, surgeon. A person who studies the weather and climate, meteorologist. A person who writes essays, essayist. A person who practices law, lawyer. A person who studies human history and prehistory through the excavation of sites and the analysis of artifacts, archaeologist. A person who mends clothes, tailor. A person who makes written copies of documents, scribe. A person who studies the stars and planets, astronomer. A person who works with wood, carpenter. A person who sings professionally, singer. A person who specializes in the science of aging, gerontologist. A person who studies insects, entomologist. A person who treats diseases by giving drugs, pharmacologist. A person who specializes in the study of bacteria, bacteriologist. A person who writes novels, novelist. A person who studies fish, ichthyologist. A person who translates written documents, translator. A person who studies the nervous system, neurologist. A person who studies rocks and the earth's structure, geologist. A person who loves himself or herself, narcissist. A person who renounces the world and practices self-discipline in order to attain salvation, ascetic. A person who works for the welfare of women, feminist. A place where weapons are stored, arsenal. One who helps people by giving them money or other aid, benefactor. A person who withdraws from the world to live in seclusion and often in solitude, recluse. A person who looks after a church and churchyard, sometimes acting as bell ringer and gravedigger, sexton. A humorous imitation of a serious piece of literature, parody. A person who abstains from alcohol, teetotaler. A person who takes a gloomy view of life, pessimist. A person who is trained to travel in a spacecraft, astronaut.